Hey, did they ever teach you this at school? Did you know that several different European nations claimed the greater Western New York area? Well, we know all about it. A few weeks ago, we talked about Fort George and learned about the British and the French, but there were more. We're going to learn about that this week in the State of Greater Western New York report, which as always is brought to you faithfully by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hey there, and welcome everyone again to the State of Greater Western New York report. We're bringing you a special edition this week. This is things they didn't teach you in school. Well, maybe a little bit they taught you, but a lot they didn't teach you about the pre-colonial or the colonial history of the Greater Western New York region. That's right, colonial history. Not just the British, but other European countries too. Why don't we start really right at the very beginning? And that would be with, who else? Christopher Columbus. That's right. He's the guy who first set sail across the sea in 1492. And what did he come across? Well, he came across nothing less than the New World. We all know that Christopher Columbus pronounced the entire New World for Spain, but that was only the beginning of the troubles, because here's what happened. On his way back, there were stormy winds, and they blew Columbus off course. He landed in Portugal on March 9th, 1493, where King John II received him, curious to see where he had been. Well, if you're King John, you'd be none too pleased about this whole thing, because what Columbus discovered, those islands that he discovered, they lay south of the Canary Islands. And there was a treaty of Alcacíves, I can't say it, the Treaty of Alcacíves, that was signed in 1479, as well as a 1481 papal bull, which is Aeterni Regis, granted all the land south of the Canary Islands to Portugal. So, where did Columbus go? He went to that land south of this dotted line here, and that made King John II mad. So what did King John do? Well, he wrote a nasty letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, telling them in no uncertain terms what he expected them to do and what he was planning to do. What was he planning to do? Well, he began to assemble an armada, and the King and Queen of Spain, they had their own thing to do. They sent a letter. They just sent a letter to somebody that they knew very well. And this person was Pope Alexander VI, who on May 4th, 1493, not too much later, by the way, if you're paying attention to dates, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull which brokered a peace between the Catholic monarchs in Portugal and Spain, and it essentially split the world in two, half for Spain and half for Portugal. Spain got the better of the deal, though, because they got the entire New World. Did I mention that Pope Alexander VI was born in Spain? So the Pope's line is going to be the dotted line on this map that you see right here. So obviously, look at that. Portugal gets pretty much nothing, so King John wasn't happy. And maybe because they were feeling a little bit guilty, Ferdinand and Isabella, they didn't consult the Pope on this, but they negotiated a separate deal with Portugal. This is called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and that was signed on June 7th, 1494, so we just had an anniversary of that. anyways, this moved the line, this world-splitting line, the dotted line, it moved it a bit further west, which gave Portugal a bigger chunk of what would eventually become Brazil. So now you know why they speak Portuguese in Brazil and not Spanish. Well, that pretty much settled everything, right? Not really. The other European monarchs, they didn't take kindly to being left out. And well, they just pretty much ignored the whole thing and they went about, doing what they did. It didn't help that, that Spain, and here's a map of Spain, this blue area, you can see what areas they were really focusing in on. So it didn't really help that Spain, they didn't really make the most of their free reign, and they sent explorers all over the New World. And while these explorers did proudly proclaim or claim every new discovery for Spain, the Spanish did precious little settling on their own, especially in the region that most concerns us. Now, talking about these wild claims, every time the Spanish explorers sat on something or landed on something, he planted a flag and claimed everything that he saw for Spain. So when Balboa crossed Panama, what is now Panama, and saw the Pacific Ocean from the east, from the eastern end of the Pacific Ocean for the very first time, he proclaimed everything that body of water touched for Spain. That was a pretty audacious claim, and Spain was really never able to live up with it. Well, imagine that on a much smaller scale in North America. Spain claimed the entirety of North America, including the greater Western New York region, but unfortunately, they didn't have the manpower to settle everywhere. So with little settling, especially in the region of the northeastern part of America, that opened things up for the other European powers. And, they actually started to take advantage of that. The French were the first to arrive in earnest. They sent explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano to chart Spain's ignored coast between Florida and Newfoundland. And like the Spanish, they were driven by religion and commerce. Remember Spanish, gold, glory, and God? Well, Spain was pretty much God and gold, although not physical gold like the Spanish, more business, commerce, trading things. Well, we'll learn about what that meant in a moment, but for the most part, they weren't really so much about colonizing. That would be for the British later. But the French did build settlements because the financial considerations were what they were focused on, and they built settlements that would help them trade. So their initial interest was in the Grand Banks because that's where all the fish were, and the lure of fur trade though drew them inland. And Samuel de Champlain ventured down the St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes through Greater Western New York, by the way, as a way of exploring this fur trade and these fur trade options. Now, there were other explorers that did it, but in effect, this led to permanent settlements for the French, as well as more friendly relations with both the indigenous Algonquins and the Huron Confederacy. The Huron Confederacy was an Iroquois-speaking peoples, whereas the Algonquin tribes spoke obviously the Algonquin language. Now this friendship, these allies actually worked both ways, both for the Indians and for the French. And what they ended up doing, again, for different reasons, they constantly fought with the Five Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. This battle was continual, and it probably predated the French. As far as we can tell, things were constantly at war. When the French initially came to the New World, inside the New World, the St. Lawrence Valley, there were a couple of Indian tribes there that they noted were fighting. When they came back a couple decades later, no more. Those Indian tribes are gone. No one knew where they went. So it's speculation is the Mohawk pushed them off the map, but nobody knows for sure. So what happened? So the war struck home, literally. When I say home, I mean in the Greater Western New York era. when Jacques René de Brisset de Nononville, otherwise called the Marquis de Nononville, he landed in Irondequoit Bay, right outside of Rochester, and marched down into the Seneca villages that are located or were located in present-day Victor and Mendon. This would be Ontario and Monroe counties, respectively. And this particular expedition, the de Nononville expedition, was part of an ongoing conflict known as the Beaver Wars, which we'll get to in a second. But the French used this opportunity to raise Ganongagon and Todiacton, two major villages, which we still have sites of today. Ganondagan is a historic site. Todiacton, it's a site, but it's pretty much kept secret. So anyways, the French came down right into the interior, the heart of Western New York, and pretty much eliminated these villages. It was a scorched earth sort of strategy. But this is in the Beaver Wars, and we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's take a step back first and take a look and see what happened with the Dutch. Now, you might not recognize that face, but you can certainly read and guess that this is Henry Hudson. So Henry Hudson was English. He was an explorer. He was hired by the Dutch East India Company in the early 1600s to try to find a Northwest Passage to the Indies. That's the purpose of the Dutch East India Company, at least initially. They wanted to find a Northwest Passage to the Indies. But instead what he found was the Hudson River. Well, it wasn't called the Hudson River at that time. And by the way, he later sailed under the British flag and found Hudson Bay, which also wasn't called Hudson Bay at the time. Although they kind of left him, they marooned him there, and no one ever saw him again. So maybe it makes sense that that they named it Hudson Bay. It's interesting that when he went up the Hudson River, Henry Hudson actually discovered something else, maybe something that was a little bit more in keeping with Dutch interests. So the Dutch now figured that this whole Northwest Passage thing was a money pit. That's why on the second voyage, it wasn't the Dutch that Henry Hudson sailed for, it was the British. But the Dutch said, forget this Northwest Passage thing. We actually can make money here in this new world. And they found that out because when Henry Hudson went up what is now the Hudson River, he discovered the fur trade. Yeah, he traded with the Indians that were there. And so the Dutch decided, hey, we're going to focus on making this colony more of a commercial venture. And so they established what ended up being a thriving colony all the way from the mouth of the Hudson River, New Amsterdam, to the end, to the upper part, which is Fort Orange. And they called this whole thing New Netherlands. Of course, today we know those cities as New York for New Amsterdam and Albany for Fort Orange. And New Netherlands, today it became the colony of New York, and today it's called the state of New York. But anyways, we'll come back to this in a second. First, I want to go back to the Beaver Wars, because the Beaver Wars really were something that had a major, major impact on the greater Western New York region from a geopolitical standpoint. Now, it's actually more than that. It extended to the entirety of North America. And when we consider what was going on at the very beginning, the Beaver Wars, before the Beaver Wars really started in earnest, we had three different European powers directly or indirectly impacting our region. These were the French, the Dutch, and the British. Now, remember, Spain at one time claimed it, but they long ago left their claim for, warmer climes down south. But in addition to the Europeans, we had a whole slew of indigenous cultures that lived in, traveled through, or otherwise affected the greater Western New York region. Now, what happened with the Beaver Wars? That's something that we're going to talk about next when we come back from our break on this episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. We'll be right back.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to the State of Greater Western New York report. We're learning about the European tug-of-war for our little piece of the world here that occurred during the colonial era. And we're at the point of what's called the Beaver Wars. The Beaver Wars pitted the Europeans and their Indian allies against each other. So on the European side, we had the French versus what amounts to the Dutch and the British. And the French allies were the Huron Confederacy, which was an Iroquois-speaking culture, as well as the Algonquin tribes, which were the northern tribes. On the British and Dutch side, their allies were essentially the Iroquois Confederacy. So who ended up being the big winner of the Beaver Wars? And remember, the Beaver Wars lasted almost the entire 17th century. So a lot was happening over time. It wasn't one continual war. They were just intermittent wars over time, little wars in little corners of the world. But over this period, things happened that really changed the face of the greater Western New York region. In fact, the big winner here was the Iroquois Confederacy. They pushed their enemies off the board, and they expanded their territory from that small portion that they had in essentially central and northern New York, and all the way through the Great Lakes, well, through most of the Great Lakes, as well as into the Ohio Valley and as far west as the Mississippi. Now, they actually had greater land claims here, but they really weren't able to make much of that. It's a huge piece of territory, and there quite frankly weren't a lot of people. And if you look at this example right here, look at Western New York. Now, that line in Western New York, the pink line is where the Seneca resided. That would be east of the Mississippi River. And that line that you see, not Mississippi, Genesee River, that line that you see there in Western New York, that's the Genesee River. And on the other side of that line were the Wenroe and the Erie, both of which were knocked out by the Iroquois. So the Iroquois were the big winners. Who was the big loser? Well, that would be the French. They were still on the map, as you can see here in blue, but they were basically on their way out. The Dutch were actually out too. So why don't you call the Dutch the big losers? Well, what happened to the Dutch? It took several iterations, but beginning in 1664, the Dutch eventually seceded their holdings over to the English, although the two would be playing this sort of ping-pong game with ownership over the next decade or so until the matter was finally settled for good in 1674. But it was really less of a battle. And if you remember from your schoolboy days or schoolgirl days, when the British Armada came up to New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant, this would be in 1664, Peter Stuyvesant said, "Okay, it's yours, you got it. I can't fight those boats, so, go ahead and take it." So that was in 1664. Well, like I said, things were going on in Europe at the same time as over here, so the land traded hands back and forth between the British and the Dutch several times until it was finally settled in 1674. But again, it was less of a battle. And pretty much in keeping with the Dutch themselves. It was more of a transaction. So the British got ownership of the land, but the Dutch were allowed to stay and basically keep working, doing what they were doing. The Dutch were really good at this commerce thing, much better than the English. And the English recognized that, so he said, hey, you know what? Let's, in effect, become partners. We'll be the political leaders here, but the business leaders we want to be the Dutch. And those two things were actually intertwined. The Dutch had this thing called a patroon system, which, if you think about it, kind of like the mafia, but not as bad or not as good, depending on your point of view. The British let them keep that. In fact, they kept them right through the Revolutionary War. And it wasn't until much later that the whole patroon system was outlawed. You know, arguments can be made that there's a legacy that remains of this, but this was a style of government, really private public government partnership that formed really kind of almost the British inherited it. So they didn't change it too much when they did it. So the Dutch are off the map. The French are still on there, but you know what's going to happen next. You know, you just can't eliminate the hostilities between the French and the English. So we end up in 1754 with the culmination of these growing tensions with the French and Indian War. At least that's what we call it. It's also called the 7 Years' War. And it took about a decade, but it would mark the final last stand in North America for the French and their allies. Now, not quite. I'll get to that in a second. But by 1763, the French were gone from the scene. And the rest, as they say, is history. So what kind of happened? So what we saw was that the French got knocked out here. The French actually owned all the way down into Louisiana. And as a result of the French and Indian War, not only did the French get knocked out of New France, but they also got knocked out of Louisiana. That went to Spain. So if you recall now, Spain, they own that whole southern portion of the United States into the Southwest. Now they also own the Louisiana Purchase. But Chris, you said, didn't we buy that from the French? Didn't Thomas Jefferson broker some deal with Napoleon in 1803 to buy that on for like 3 cents an acre or something like some incredibly low price? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Because in 1802, the Spanish gave that ownership of Louisiana back to the French. And the French turned around and sold it for money because they needed money. So that really is way off the map in terms of what we're concerned about here. But what we're looking at, and you can see how even within the French and Indian War, there was obviously some aspect of that war that involved the greater Western New York region, primarily through Fort Niagara, which you can see that battle map going in there from 1759 and 1760, what was going on there, where it changed hands from the French to the British. Well, this is the point where Britain really basically takes over what is today Canada. It also eliminated pretty much everything that was in conflict over here. So now we have the British in control from the European side. We have the Iroquois Confederacy in control from the Indian side. Still, there's not going to be a lot of settlement, if any, in the greater Western New York region, and that includes the Seneca. The Seneca did take over a village, one of the remaining villages, from the Erie, but they really didn't settle much farther beyond the Genesee River by the time we get to the Revolutionary War. So, is everything's going to go smooth sailing, right? Well, in the greater Western New York region, no, it's not really going to go smooth sailing. In fact, that's a major story about just who owns Western New York from the European standpoint, which is probably a tale best told on another day. So with that, I want to thank everybody for bearing with us today and listening to what we had in terms of the story of the tug-of-war between European powers that occurred during the colonial period. If you want to be a live audience member, that allows you to ask any sort of questions that you want and of any of our guests, then just go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and you can be a member of the live audience every Thursday at noon. Every once in a while, we might change that time a little bit, but hey, generally at noon, that's when the live broadcast occurs. You can watch it on Zoom and ask any questions through chat that you'd like, and we'll refer those over to the guest. You will get the link, by the way, that Thursday morning. So you don't have to remember it. You'll get it every Thursday morning, the link to the show, and you'll be able to go on and watch what we have. So if you can't make it the live edition, which I understand people work for a living, so it's not unusual that they would have to actually work rather than watch a show, you can always catch it on our archive site, which is stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Look at that. It's the same sort of site that you saw down here, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Just go there. You can catch all of our old episodes and catch up on things, history, science, travel, leisure, government, politics, business, any of those shows you can watch and maybe learn, pick up something new and exciting from. Otherwise, if you are a subscriber to our YouTube channel, or if you like our Facebook page, then when the program is rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30, both of those platforms will notify you when it begins to air. So you don't even have to remember it. If you've got things set up right, it'll say, hey, guess what? The State of Greater Western New York is now being broadcast on the platform. So go watch it. And again, it's up there for as long as those two platforms exist. It'll be up there. You can always watch it. So that's all we have for this week. We'll see you all next week on the State of Greater Western New York Report. Thank you all for watching.